Professor Oba T'Shaka. So we ask you to come to the center. Professor Oba T'Shaka is an activist scholar, renowned public speaker, professor, workshop leader, author, leader, organizer, and visionary of exceptional influence, who addresses audiences in the United States, Britain, France, and Africa. For 38 years, Dr. T'Shaka was a professor at San Francisco State University, where he's now a professor emeritus and still continues to teach. Dr. Nathan here says, and I quote, Oba T'Shaka is one of the key social philosophies in the African American race today, philosophers in the African American race today. The late Dr. Asa Hillard, a great educator and scholar, said of Dr. Oba T'Shaka, and I quote, he is one of the most powerful, deep thinkers in the world today. When my family and I arrived in San Francisco in 1963, Oba T'Shaka was a young, powerful leader in the middle of a civil rights struggle. Since that time, he has been totally consistent as an uncompromising truth seeker, visionary, organizer, and leader in African liberation in the United States and on the continent of Africa. He has published newspapers, he has led organizations, he has been and is a courageous activist, end of quote. In the course of his organizing, Professor Oba T'Shaka, then known as Bill Bradley, while leading the San Francisco civil rights movement, collaborated with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King around movement strategies. He worked with Deacons for Self-Defense, working with them in Louisiana in 1965, and with their West Coast representative, Chilly Willie. Dr. T'Shaka marched with Dr. King in Selma, Alabama in 1965, serving as a march leader in the Selma to Montgomery March. In 1995, Professor Oba T'Shaka addressed the Million Man March, speaking to 950,000 black men and providing follow-up strategy for the march. Dr. Philip McGee, former Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, observed that Dr. Oba T'Shaka's scholarship has been field tested. Professor Oba T'Shaka is the author of 5 books, each of which grew out of years of study and organizational practice. Dr. T'Shaka is a rare blend of a master scholar, master activist, and charismatic speaker, whose many years of organizing and scholarship has provided a rich body of experience in writing, teaching, and public speaking. Please put your hands together. Please come to the center and help me welcome to the podium our very, very special guest, activist, revolutionary scholar, Professor Oba T'Shaka.
Our ancient Kemetic ancestors, Hotep, peace. It's good to see all these beautiful brothers and sisters here in Ocho Rios, Jamaica. You know what I mean? This is a great honor for me to have a chance to do some sharing of some ideas on the Honorable Mosiah Walimu Marcus Garvey. This is a special honor for me because Garvey is my first political father. In the Black Liberation Movement in the 1960s, most of us did not know about Garvey until 1963. And so in the midst of leading a movement in San Francisco, I discovered Garvey and realized that this was the best organizer that Africans had produced up to that point, and we can say in the 20th century. And if we didn't draw from him, we were going to make some serious mistakes. So to honor Marcus Garvey in the 100th anniversary of the founding of the UNIA, it is a great honor to share some thoughts with you. I want to dedicate what I have to say to the sufferers, the poor, the people in Trenchtown, the people in Ocho Rios, the poor who are catching hell. Because if you didn't get it from this introduction, I'm a revolutionary. And what I care most about is poor people. You hear me? Poor black people and poor people in general. And so this speech, this presentation, is dedicated to the sufferers who are undergoing sufferation in this country, the sufferers in Africa, the sufferers around the world, and all sufferers. Because if you care about the least, you care about everyone. Am I telling the truth? I want to have a grounding with my brothers and sisters, or in your terms, a groundation to the Jamaican nation and to those of you who are here from Ocho Rios. I want to speak to the Africans who are conscious and the ones that don't even know they're African. You know what I'm talking about? Who may be more African than many who are conscious of being African. And when I thought about this presentation, I said, you know, this isn't easy, because I'm up here talking to a bunch of Jamaicans and they know Garvey better than I do. So if I come in here giving you the standard stuff on Garvey, you've already heard it. So I said, I got to do something else. So my groundation for the nation is this. Marcus Garvey, the voice of Jamaican and African American culture. Marcus Garvey, the voice for Jamaican and African American culture. And I chose this as a way to honor the Honorable Mosiah Marcus Garvey, because Amilcar Cabral, who is probably the greatest leader in the 20th century, bar none, he led the liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau and the Cape Verde Islands, was assassinated in 1972, but was the best organizer, best political thinker. And he made this comment, and this is why I chose this topic. He said, the liberation movement is an act of culture. What he meant is, if we're going to honor the Honorable Mosiah Marcus Garvey, we have to honor the culture that gave birth to him and the culture that he spoke to, because black people would not have followed him had he not been true to the highest principles of our culture. Am I telling the truth? Cabral also said this: a people can measure their chance for achieving liberation by how different their culture is from the culture of the oppressor. To the extent that you take on the oppressor's culture, you won't even know you're oppressed. You know what I'm talking about? You'll suffer from the disease of whiteitis. You will be satisfied with your oppressed condition, and you will even say that you aren't oppressed. You haven't ever experienced racism, and you even love your enemy. Y'all know what I'm talking about? So I want to talk about the popular culture that inspired Garvey, but I also want to speak to how liberation movements, when they speak to the highest levels of the culture, they raise the culture to a higher level. And Marcus Mosiah Garvey and the UNIA raised the culture of Pan-Africanism to a higher level. But it's only when you're true to the truths of the culture. Can I prove it? We have had for over a couple of hundred years of enslavement shoved down our throat the teaching that black is inferior. The blacker you are, the worse you are. And some of us even struggle to get out of blackness with skin bleaching cream or anything that will get us away from being our true selves. When God made us the world's first people, and as a result, we should be proud of this blackness. And I want to say to the Jamaicans, because a lot of people, when I say this, they will say, me too, but I'll say this. Many Jamaicans are descended from the Akan and the Asante in Ghana. Not all, but many. And what you know about the Akan is they are some of the most beautiful people on the planet. And this is my third time in Jamaica. And I think all black is beautiful, but I'm going to tell you something. Your ladies in here are some of the finest ladies on the planet Earth. You know what I'm talking about? And the men are too. And I'm not saying that to appeal to this audience. I'm married to a beautiful sister from Barbados. Raise your hand there. Pamela Hurley T'Shaka. You know what I mean? And she's beautiful. And my mama was beautiful. But I've seen these Jamaican women, I say, my God. So we've had shoved down our throats this idea that black is inferior. But our culture, because what I want to speak to this afternoon is how Africans who were brought here from Africa, and you know the really only big difference between the African in Jamaica, Barbados, or the United States is they dropped you off in different islands and different places. We all came from the same place. Y'all know that? But then what happened in these places is we took Africa and we reshaped it in the environment in which we found ourselves. And we came up with a new African culture, the culture of Jamaica. You know, I look at Jamaica, Jamaica's little Africa. The conscious Africans know it. The Rastas know it. But the average Jamaican doesn't know it. You understand? And the thing is, what we did is we reworked out of the fundamental principles of African culture something new to suit this situation. So your patois, what is it? It's an African language. And when it's really spoke, I have to ask my wife to translate it. What'd they say? Huh? So, you know, when your culture is different from that of the oppressor, and when it reaches to a higher level, that's what gives you the chance for liberation. So they drummed in our head that we're inferior, they're superior. But in the United States, we came up with this idea of race consciousness. And the average black mother will tell their child, you're just as good as anybody else. The blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. You understand? Now, these are black mothers who don't know squat about Africa, but they understand black pride. And I'm dedicating this to the sufferers because it's everyday black people that didn't know much about Africa, but who loved their blackness that woke this brainwashed so-called former Negro up. Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael said it was everyday black people, and he was a good friend of mine, who taught him to be proud of being black. So your chance for achieving liberation is measured by how different your culture is from the culture of the oppressor. We have had drummed into our heads for over 200 years, and there's a slave narrative in the United States where an enslaved African said, a savage in Africa, a slave in America or the Caribbean or anywhere else. And some of us still believe that. It's sad to say. You know what I mean? Because we've seen Tarzan movies. You know, we've seen how the media has distorted the image of Africa. And it's led some of us not to like ourselves. Am I telling the truth? But the fact is, the culture of Jamaica, the culture of the Caribbean, the culture of Africa from which it draws rests on a fundamental principle of humanism. And this principle says that God is in every human being that he, she created. And every human being is sacred, is divine. And so how can any human being be savage? So in the midnight of slavery, our people in the Caribbean, in the U.S., they refused to accept it. Isn't that amazing? Because they said no human beings should undergo this kind of sufferation. And so they came out of slavery. This is amazing. Because most people who have been enslaved came out real sick. They came out with their humanity intact. And the proof of that is how kind most of our people are. Is that the truth? Am I telling the truth? And I noticed that with the Jamaican because the Jamaican has that African personality, that niceness. Though if you're in Trenchtown, you got to be tough. I understand it. Just like New York or Mississippi. But even under the toughness of the exterior of the African American, touch him and you'll see somebody who's nice. You hear me? Basically nice. And that's a definition of being civilized, by the way. Civil is being nice, is being kind, and is being gentle. We have had shoved through our heads and our ears since enslavement this idea that the West is a democracy. United States is a great democracy. The IMF comes in here and imposes various things on you, but they always come talking democratic talk. But they never consult you on the measures that they impose on you. I think you ought to give the IMF a new name. Instead of International Monetary Fund, you should call it the International Misery Fund. Because basically, they're imposing misery on the poor and joy on the rich. And you know that Jamaica was once a prosperous island. In the 70s, you were the most prosperous island in the Caribbean. Why? Because you were self-sufficient in what you produced. You could take care of yourself. But since the miseration of the IMF, the International Misery Fund, you have seen almost everything you own taken from you. And you see yourself taking on American produce. So they come telling you that they're for democracy. But in fact, they practice hypocrisy. Because the U.S. is not a democracy. It's a republic. And in fact, government in the U.S. is set up to protect the rich. Read the second treatise on government. Read that, and it explains how government in the West works. But our popular culture is based on democracy. Because African people are a people that have to have a say-so in everything. Am I telling the truth? It's amazing that Garvey got us together because we're the hardest people to organize. Because we all got to have a say-so, and that comes out of your African traditions. So that your chance for achieving liberation is based on how much you draw from the best of your own culture. The West will talk all this hypocrisy about humanity, but we know that Western culture favors material things over human beings. Am I telling the truth? But the culture of mighty Africa, the culture of the Africans in the Caribbean who reconstructed a culture here, the culture of Africans in the United States. My father explained to me that during the Depression, black people were thriving, but white people had their bones sticking out of them. And I said, well, why was that? He said, well, it's because you could go into any black person's house and they would feed you. And that's because the African ethos is communal. It's sharing. And the best way for us to construct an economy is communalism, through sharing. It is better than capitalism that makes the rich rich and the poor poor. So when you draw from the best of your culture, then what do you have? What you have is a sense of empowerment because you have a roof over your head, food to eat, and you can enjoy your life. And everyone has a right to the tree of life. Am I telling the truth? Everybody. Nobody should be suffering. So if we look at the culture of Africa, I want to bring in one other. The West has a notion of freedom. We don't really understand what that notion is. We've been sold the idea, the U.S., freedom, justice, equality. The French, liberty, equality, fraternity. It all sounds fancy. But when they get to practicing it, it boils down to something else. Their philosophy of freedom, I want you to hear this, comes from their first philosopher. His name was Hesiod. He was a Greek philosopher. He was illiterate. He was a poet, and he was a sheep herder. Now, in Africa, we call this the oral tradition, but white people put down people that can't read and write. So it's interesting that the foundation of their culture is with Hesiod. He's their deep thinker. You understand? And Hesiod's notion of freedom was this. It's arbitrary. Whoever has the power does whatever they want to do with it. Does that resemble what you see in the world today? George Bush couldn't spell Hesiod. He didn't know a thing about Hesiod, but he was a Hesiod man. But the new African and the African American and the African Caribbean conception of freedom is this. We have a philosopher that comes out of jazz. His name is Dizzy Gillespie. See, I'm talking about the popular culture. and the classical culture. Dizzy Gillespie was a great trumpet player. And Dizzy said, you know, the African American and the new African conception of freedom is really contradictory. He said it's based on discipline and freedom. In other words, our concept of freedom is you're not free to be arbitrary. You have to exercise discipline in whatever you do to be free. You know what I'm saying? And our discipline says you got to be righteous. And we're here to honor the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. One reason is because he stood on righteousness. You hear me? He wasn't arbitrary. So we can measure the chance of a people achieving freedom by how different their culture is from the culture of the oppressor. Look at the world today. Two groups of people that are really making progress are the Japanese and the Chinese. Look at the Japanese. Now, I understand this when I give this example. They didn't undergo slavery. They didn't have a couple of hundred years of brainwashing. The Japanese country was never colonized, and the Chinese was only under semi-colonialism, only partially colonized. They had some drugs run on them, but they were able to maintain their system. But still, the lesson is relevant, and it's this. Look at the Japanese. They were behind the West in the 18th and 17th century. So what did they decide to do? They decided to master science and technology. Marcus Garvey said, the race that masters science and technology will rule the world. You hear me? Black people shouldn't be interested in ruling the world. We should just be interested in ruling our own vine and fig tree. You know what I mean? Our own piece of land. So that if you look at the Japanese, they went around the world and studied all these systems that they had everywhere and brought it back to Japan. And they had what they called the Meiji Restoration, and they came up with a scientific and technological people that were actually more advanced than the Westerners, and they defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War of 1900. They were the first yellow country to defeat a white country using science and technology. But my point is this. The Japanese made the decision to stay Japanese, even though a lot of white influences are in Japan. At the bottom of the Japanese is their culture. And what's the bottom of it, the foundation? It's Shintoism. And what is Shintoism? The worship of Japanese ancestors. If you place your ancestors first, you will definitely place your people first. You hear what I'm telling you? Look at the Chinese. Look at the Chinese. When the rest of Southeast Asia went under a few years ago, the IMF came in and imposed stuff on Indonesia and started grabbing all their wealth. The Chinese said, hell no. You're not taking none of our stuff. And the Chinese went on to move their economy to where in 20 years they'll be the foremost power in the world. And why is that? 1,300,000,000 Chinese people follow the leadership of less than 100 elder men. Why? Because in spite of the fact, and I don't want to glorify them, they have corruption in China. You know what I mean? They got capitalism in China, but it's a Chinese capitalism, but they've taken 300 billion poor people out of poverty, while America has sunk millions and millions of poor people into poverty. You hear me? Why? Why is it that the Chinese will listen to their own leadership? Because they observe the culture of Confucianism. You hear me? And what is the essence of that culture? It comes from a principle called Li, L-I, which means order. See, everybody's ethos is suited, you know, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you think, the way you govern yourself. It's suited to what you need. 1,300,000,000 people have got to have some order. But they insist on it being a just order. And so now you have a new chairman of China, a new president. He's trying to uproot corruption. I don't really think he is, but he's trying to get the people to think he is, because if not, 1,300,000,000 people will throw that 100 out. You hear what I'm telling you? So what's the state of African people? We're in a mess. Let's be honest about it. Africa's in a mess. The Caribbean is in a mess. One of the bright jewels in the Caribbean is Barbados, where they have free education, free medical care, and where their leaders can walk down the street without any armed security. You understand? And now they're facing the IMF, and the IMF is trying to do what they've done to you, which is to take their currency and devalue it and turn their currency into something worthless. Why would they do that? To impose miseration on you so that you will come back to them for more so they can impose more. So that Africa's in trouble. Why? Because we don't honor the best in our culture. Am I telling the truth? Now, I know I'm talking to the conscious, so I'm not referring to you. I'm not referring to the Rastas. I'm not referring to the conscious Africans in Jamaica or around the world. I'm referring to the majority. And that's not true of Africa, by the way. The majority of Africans do observe African culture. Their problem is they're not allowed to practice it at the level of running their societies. You understand? But us in the Western Hemisphere, we've got a problem. And you know what that problem is? If you ask the average Jamaican, if you tell the average Jamaican he's an African, not you conscious ones, what does he say? I ain't no African, I'm a Jamaican. If you ask the average Barbadian, what is he? I ain't no African, I'm a Barbadian. If you ask the average black person from Mississippi or South Carolina, where they should ashamed to say that's where they're from, where they hang you from a low tree or a high tree. If they hang you from a high tree, they're a conservative. And if they hang you from a low tree, they're a liberal. Either way, your neck gets stretched. And what are they saying? I'm from, can't even spell the word, Mississippi. That's where I'm from, Mississippi. You understand? And then what else do they say? I didn't lose anything in Africa. You hear me? Have you heard that before? Man, I don't want anything to do with Africa. I didn't lose anything in Africa. Meanwhile, the French want something to do with Africa. The British want something to do with Africa. The Chinese want something to do with Africa. The President of the United States just had 52 African leaders lined up in the White House with all these corporations lined up so they could gobble up what's left of Africa. But 00 Soul, remote control, automatic pilot Negro, he don't want anything to do with his roots. You hear me? Marcus Garvey said, we lost our manhood in Africa. Malcolm X said, we lost our minds in Africa. And I say we lost our historical memory in Africa. We become a race of historical amnesiacs. Am I telling the truth? We have created a culture that's new African. And here's a contradiction. Most of us don't know it's African. Conscious people do. Most of us don't. And the main reason we don't is we feel satisfied with not knowing about our past. And why is that? We believe that message that's been dropped in our head over 200 years ago, that Africa is a savage place, and I don't want to have anything to do with Africa. Marcus Garvey said, we gave birth to civilization, and what you did great yesterday will inspire you to greatness today and tomorrow. You hear me? It's clear. We are the fruit of Africa. We're the branches of Africa. Africa's the root. There is no way you can love the branches and the fruit unless you love the root. Am I telling the truth? Huh? And when you love the root, everything else will work well. I bet you if the average Jamaican in here loved their African roots, they would also love Jamaican products. And they would not have to be so caught up in foreign things. Who in the hell wants powdered milk over real milk? Powdered milk that comes from the U.S. and your good milk that was driven out of business. So that foreign things aren't always the best. And you know, because Chinese love China, Chinese favor Chinese things. Why? Because when you favor your own things, you empower yourself. Am I telling the truth? And when you empower yourself, you become strong. So if we look at this culture, we can see that we have to draw from the best of our past to move forward into the future. Now, in the 60s, Garvey had a big influence on the movements in the 60s. Most people don't know this. Rosa Parks' grandmother, the sister who refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, and grandfather were Garveyites. Rosa Parks' greatest hero, she loved King, but her greatest hero was Malcolm X. El Hajj, Malik, El Shabazz. You hear what I'm telling you? Malcolm X. And this was one of the kindest, gentlest, nicest, and toughest women you could lay your eyes on. Rosa Parks, a woman of principle who suffered all her life for taking a principled stand. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad organized the Nation of Islam. He was called the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He had been a corporal in the Garvey movement. So the Garvey movement penetrated the popular culture of the 60s. Malcolm X's mother and father were members of the Garvey movement. And many like me and others, Kwame Ture and others, discovered Garvey, and Garvey helped give us a sense of direction. Now, the key thing is, why could Garvey give us this sense of direction? Because Garvey drew from the popular culture. This is what we often don't get. You know, we often take our leaders and pull them out of history and just talk about how great they were, but we don't look at what made them great. You hear me? And every movement for liberation, the greatness of that movement is measured by the greatness of that culture, and that's measured by the greatness of the people that produce that culture. And the people that produce this new African culture in Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the United States are everyday black people. And maybe one reason why we don't honor it is because we're ashamed to honor everyday black people. But we should honor them because guess what? The popular culture is created by everyday people who didn't go to universities, who didn't get miseducated. They drew from what they believed in most. Zora Neale Hurston, one of our great anthropologists, made this comment. She said, we were most African during enslavement. Why? Because we had just come from Africa. And so what we put together, which became this new African culture in the Caribbean and the U.S., had an African foundation to it. And so as a result, the folk, everyday black people, created this culture. And everyday black people, only when they agree to it is this culture given the stamp of approval. There's a saying that an enslaved African had. He said this, and this is a real secret for a lot of us. He made this comment. He said, only the blacks can move the blacks. Listen to that. In the United States, there has never been a mass movement of blacks with whites leading them. Not one. Not one. And I would suspect that's true in many parts of the Caribbean. And why is that? Because the leaders that we look up to are mouthing the culture. They are giving birth and voice to the culture. Amy Jock Garvey, Marcus Garvey's second wife, he liked the Amys, you know? He liked the Amys. Amy Jock Garvey referred to Garvey, and she said, when he came to the United States in 1916, he would go around, you know, he traveled around the United States to assess the condition of black people. But then he would get into New York and he'd get on one of these ladders, you know, and start to speak. And sometimes he'd fall off the ladder. He fell off the ladder because he was hungry. He often had holes in his shoes because he was broke. But one thing about this popular culture that we've created is it comes from everyday black people's experience of the ups and downs of life. We have a saying in the States, a spiritual that says, sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh, yes, Lord. And Garvey knew from what he drew from his people that when he got down, he'd get up again. The thing about Garvey is the UNIA rested on two cultural traditions. The cultural tradition of the African in the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica, and the cultural tradition of the African in the United States. And there are some unique features that each culture has, but we share more in common than separates us. Though this culture is more traditional African, because you're the majority on your land. It just would help if we knew it. You know what I mean? We need to popularize this culture that we love so much. Because, you know, culture is what picks you up in the morning. Culture is what you eat. Culture is your mama and your papa. It's the wisdom that you get. You hear me? You can't survive without culture. You know what I'm talking about? And given the separation that poor people are suffering here, without culture, we wouldn't exist. Culture gives us hope. We're one of the most hopeful people on the planet. And you'd wonder why. But that's what sustained us. So that Garvey drew from the land tradition of the Caribbean and Jamaica. And you know, y'all have this thing where you have land, and whereas in the United States, we're supposed to get 40 acres and a mule, we didn't get a mule or 1 acre. You hear me? But you all had some land. Garvey worked for his paternal uncle, his father's brother, on 25 acres of land. And Garvey kept books. But Garvey noticed that his uncle grew every kind of food provision, every kind. And Garvey was proud of that. He came out of that tradition. And you know, the average Jamaican, who until the 70s made you self-sufficient, that one who may not be able to read and write, that one whose clothes were raggedy, that one who often didn't have shoes, he might have only had 2 acres of land. But he would walk across those 2 acres of land and act like he was the king of some great empire. Or she, because you know, men and women did that work. And they would walk across with this pride. And they would say, this piece of land belongs to me. Garvey drew from that part of the popular cultural tradition of the African and the Caribbean. Am I telling the truth? You hear me? And that's what keeps you alive, your ground provisions, not the ones that come from the West. In the United States, we have to depend on supermarkets. What happens when they shut down the supermarkets? And I understand now, here in Jamaica, black people only own 1 supermarket the Chinese have bought the rest of. And I'm not knocking the native Chinese, because I know the native Chinese have lived here a long time. But these are rich Chinese who come from China, have bought it up. Am I telling the truth? Huh? So the thing is, Garvey's movement was the first anti-colonial movement organized in the U.S. It grew out of this land tradition of self-government. Garvey's movement had a president general of Africa. He had a president of America, a guy named Eason. He had an African Legion, an army. Check this out. An army. Uh-oh. He had Black Cross nurses. They were there to patch you up in the battle for Africa. When you started bleeding, they would be there to see that you survived. You hear? He had the Black Factories Corporation. He thought like he was leading a nation, like he was leading a government. That's what he drew from this Jamaican popular culture, this Caribbean popular culture. And I'm here to tell you that when Jamaicans really wake up, the average one wakes up to their Africanness, they will say nobody can come from the outside and tell us how to run our economy. We'll determine what we do ourselves. And I'm not telling you either, because I can't. That's your decision. Nobody can export a revolution. They got to be made where the people are. Am I telling the truth? Of course, revolution might scare people. Garvey drew from another plank of this new African culture. Now, Garvey was very insightful. He traveled around the United States when he first came. And Garvey had some observations that were even deeper than most of us had. Because, you know, when you're on the outside, you sometimes see things that people on the inside don't see. And so Garvey made this observation. He said, because at that time that we were called Negroes, he said the American Negro is the most advanced Negro, and he's talking about Africans all over the world, organizationally. They have the best developed organizations. And he said the secret is they are the most conscious group. He said the reason is they live in close proximity to their oppressor. And because of living in close proximity to their oppressor, they have a deep sense of race consciousness. You hear me? Now, Garvey saw something that we didn't see. We knew we had race consciousness, but we didn't know what our position was in relationship to Africans throughout the world. And so Garvey had that appreciation. So race consciousness is the fuel that lit the fire of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. You hear what I'm telling you? Because the African in America and in the Caribbean, we came as Igbo, Yoruba, Asante. We didn't call ourselves African, not because we were ashamed of Africa, but because that was not the term we used. We came as ethnicities, Yoruba, Asante, Dogon, whatever. But over a period of time in the United States, we concluded that we were catching hell not because of the tribe we came from, but because of the color of our skin. And so we concluded that race consciousness was the key thing. So race consciousness is this idea that wherever Africans are, of the same sable skin, whatever the variety of their complexion may be, they are one people. It is the idea, and this is the thing that a lot of people don't understand about everyday black people in the United States. The everyday black person is a nationalist. They won't call themselves a nationalist, but they belong to a black church. They belong to black social organizations. 97% of them marry black. You understand? The music they listen to is black. The culture they love is black. The food they eat is black. And I call that black nationalism. And the key thing is they're racially conscious. And so Garvey understood the race consciousness of black people, and this was a key element in terms of being able to launch the Garvey movement. Now, this is the key thing. Garvey's been accused of not liking white people. Not true. Garvey was a humanist. And the thing about race consciousness is the average black person in the United States does not harbor hatred towards other people, because the average black person in the United States believes that all human beings have the divine spark of God within them. And so as a result, race consciousness is not racist. This is a key thing to understand. Now, Garvey brought certain qualities to the movement. It wasn't just that the movement was an expression of culture. Garvey had talent. What were his talents? Garvey was a master propagandist. He was a master propagandist. The UNIA Negro World newspaper is the best newspaper that blacks organized in the U.S. in the 20th century. Nation of Islam, Muhammad Speaks, and the Black Panther are the two other outstanding newspapers. And a man named Hubert Harrison deserves credit for this, along with Garvey, because Hubert Harrison took this newspaper and honed it into a well-oiled machine. It was the only newspaper in the United States that had a book section. You hear me? Because black people were reading at that time. And y'all know if you want to lead, you need to read. Am I telling the truth? Huh? If you want to be a leader, you better be a reader. And you better read yourself, and you better read your enemy. And you better read the world. John Henry Clark is one of the people that I apprenticed under. I was in his house once. He had a library of 25,000 books. And John Henry Clark was as blind as a bat at that point. And I pulled one of the books out of his shelf, and he told me, as blind as he was, that book's in the wrong place, and took it and put it in the right place. And like Garvey, he didn't have no full-bred college education. He was better educated than most people that go to college because he hit the books. You hear what I'm telling you? Hit the books. So the thing is about Garvey is, Garvey was a great public speaker. But I don't know if you know this, in Jamaica, when he first debated, he lost the debate. He couldn't defend himself. So what did he do? He started going to black churches to study black preachers. Because you know they're the best speakers we have generally. And then he would practice this. And he engaged in debates. So elocution became a specialty of Garvey. Garvey was also a skilled printer. And he had pride in that. That's another tradition that he drew from Jamaica. This tradition of the artisan. Because his father was a brick mason, a stone mason. Garvey was a master printer. He had pride in what he could do with his hands. And that's what led him to build a newspaper. Without that newspaper, he would not have been able to mobilize Africans all over the world. But without the message that came from the culture, that newspaper would not have had any effect. Garvey was a master organizer. He organized the largest mass movement, who knows how many millions of African people all over the world. Nobody knows, but all over the world. And that's also because he was a big thinker. He didn't think little, he thought big, gigantically big, and he was a little man. So his thoughts had no relationship to his physical size. Now this is something that's real interesting about Garvey. We're here to honor the founding of the UNIA, 1900, August the 1st, Emancipation Day for black people in Jamaica. Garvey formed the UNIA here in 1900, August the 1st. But I'm going to tell you some things you don't know, I don't think. When Garvey formed this organization, he didn't want it to be political. He wanted it to be fraternal. You hear me? Not political. Now, isn't this interesting? When Garvey formed this, he sent a letter to King George. I want you to hear this. And he said to King George that he supported the British in World War I. Did you know that? No. And I'm not knocking Garvey because, see, one of the things we got to understand is great leaders often start out small. Great leaders often start out unconscious. Malcolm X was at the dead level when he was in prison. He wanted to be white. You hear me? But we wouldn't be honoring El Hajj Malik El Shabazz had he not made a different decision later on. You hear what I'm telling you? And so the thing is, Garvey started off taking positions that he didn't embrace later on. And this, I think, is the most important thing because we need to make the past serve the present. We need to be able to draw from the best of our past so we can use it right now. And why is it that Garvey changed? Amilcar Cabral and others made this observation. Most leaders in the liberation movement have been touched by the white man because most of them have been educated in European educational institutions. Garvey was not. Garvey was largely self-educated. So he didn't have a hatred towards black people. He loved black people. But he had taken on an assimilation into the politics of Britain. And so a man named Carter G. Woodson, he identified this, and Garvey underwent a mental reconstruction or a mental conversion. The same conversion that Malcolm underwent, the same conversion that Cabral underwent, the same conversion that any serious revolutionary leader has to go through. And what is this based on? Carter G. Woodson made this observation. He said, for educated in the mixed schools, he was referring in the U.S. to integrated universities, or into all black colleges. He said, blacks are taught to love the Greek, the Roman, and the Teuton, and blacks are taught to hate and despise the African and to despise their own people. And so Garvey did not hate his own people, but Garvey had become assimilated into identifying with the British Empire. You understand? Just as many of his people had. And so as a result, he had to undergo mental conversion or mental reconstruction. Let me explain that, because I've undergone that. And many of you who are conscious have or should have. In the 60s, I was a college student. I was in law school, leading a movement of 10,000 people. And I thought I knew everything. My favorite word was I know. You know what I mean? And I'm eating lunch at a black restaurant, Virginia's restaurant, because the black community fed us. Because we worked 18 hours a day, no pay, 5 years, you know? And so over lunch, a good friend of mine named Norman Brown, who drove my wife and me to the airport. He's about 3 years older than me. He's from a town that Zora Neale Hurston came from that's all black. He never saw a white person until he went to New York. And me, I had been raised up all around white people. And my father was very black, and he was teaching me the consciousness, but I didn't get it. And so Norman Brown began to explain to me how the government worked, because I was as politically assimilated as Garvey. I didn't support the American war effort, but I bought into the idea that America was a democracy, because that's what I was told, and didn't do any thinking. And so when this brother explained to me that this is hypocrisy, that the corporations run the government, I began to have my first free thoughts in my life. And I was saying to him, I know, and to myself I was saying, oh shit, I'm in trouble. 4 years of college, 2 years of law school, it's wasted. I need to go back and re-educate myself. When Malcolm's brother Reginald brought him the message of who his enemy was, Malcolm said he had his first free thoughts in his life. And so this is what influenced the Honorable Marcus Garvey. Garvey underwent a mental reconstruction. And what is that? Where your philosophy changes from a European one to an African one. Where your thought pattern changes to one where you may not like yourself to where you love yourself. Where your attitude and your behavior patterns change from what Garvey said, where you have fishbone to where you have backbone. Y'all understand what I'm saying? Where a new person is born. And if you don't birth a new person, you cannot birth a new society. This is the key thing. And this was the message of Cabral. Cabral underwent this kind of transformation, and he was trying to produce it among other leaders. One reason why Africa's in trouble is its leaders are working out of the playbook of white supremacy that miseducated them. And what they want is the same greedy stuff that the whites have, except when we take someone else's culture, we go further with it than they do. We get out of pocket with it. That's true with the gangsters. When we become gangsters, we become the worst gangsters you ever lay your eyes on. When in fact, white gangsters are at least Italian. We lose our identity. You understand? So the thing is, Garvey underwent mental reconstruction. Now, Garvey was ready to leave the United States. This is generally not understood. Because while he traveled around the United States, he had not really picked up the mood and the thought of the masses of black people. He understood race consciousness, but his organization wasn't able to get off the ground. He had originally come to the United States to meet Booker T. Washington. He didn't come to organize a militant organization. And so he just happens to attend a meeting called by a man named Hubert Harrison that I've mentioned before. It was called the Liberty League. 1,000 angry young black men and women were at this meeting. And what Garvey found was at this meeting was this new cultural spirit of what they called the new Negro, the awakened African. And they were saying, we fought in World War I to make the world safe for democracy, and we're coming back and we're facing lynchings, and we're facing bloody summers in Chicago and other places, and they were fighting back. They organized armed resistance. And they said, we're not taking this anymore. And so Garvey becomes attuned to the mass of people who are militant and radical. And so Garvey changes from a pro-war, pro-British, to anti-war. Not only anti-British war, anti-American war, anti-imperialist war. Y'all getting the point here. The success of the Garvey movement was that it expressed the radicalism of new African culture. That was the success of it. That it drew from that it understood that. And this is the key thing to apply to today. If you're undergoing awakening, studying your past is important. But you've got to join your people in a struggle for liberation. You hear me? And that's when you undergo the real transformation. And that's when the assimilated black, whether he's politically assimilated or culturally assimilated, whatever this, wants to be white, whatever, he begins to lose his sense of identifying with his oppressor, and he identifies with his people, and he enters the struggle as an equal. Garvey joined the struggle. He became a mouthpiece for the struggle. He began to lead a struggle, and he could only lead it as long as he was radical. Because you know what? The radicalism of Garvey was worldwide. It wasn't just the Garvey movement. In the Caribbean, blacks came back from World War I, they were angry. In Africa, they were angry. That anti-war sentiment fueled the fire of a global movement. That's why Garvey could build a global movement. And he took race first, race consciousness, and used it around an anti-war position. In 1963, I mentioned that we were first exposed to Garvey by a man named Cronin. He wrote a book called Marcus Garvey, Black Moses. And that's when we discovered Garvey. And I began to apprentice under Garvey. When I say that, I mean I began to imitate those things of Garvey that we needed, one of which was economic self-reliance. In 1966, I led an effort in the Fillmore to build 211 cooperative units of housing that today, 1,400 square feet, black people can live in for $170 a month. And we named those units Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King cooperatives. You hear what I'm saying? Huh? And black people are living under a Marcus Garvey and a Martin Luther King, 2 M's. You know what I mean? So Garvey had this impact. But Cronin distorted Garvey's image. And there are a lot of people who buy into this. This is what Cronin said about Garvey. He said, but Cronin distorted Garvey's image. And there are a lot of people who buy into this. This is what Cronin said about Garvey. He said, he may not have understood it. See, white writers always think we're dumb. So as a result, they'll do this qualifying remark, oh, he may not have understood it. So I'm getting ready to attack him, but you know, he just probably wasn't smart enough to really understand anyway. So forgive him, when in fact he is seriously attacking him. So what did he say? He said, Marcus Garvey may not have realized it, but he was a racial chauvinist. I rarely go to Webster's dictionary, but I wanted to make sure that I quoted it right. And racial chauvinism means a racist. Why don't you just say it, sucker? You understand? A racist. Huh? Well, the thing is, the Garvey movement was drawn out of African culture, reworked into this setting in Jamaica, into a new African form. And what is the central principle of African culture and Jamaican culture? It's human. It's humane. And if you listen to the Akan have a saying, which some Jamaicans are descended from. They say this: the human being does not come from the earth, the human being comes from God. You hear me? They also say that every human being is sacred because they have the divine spark of God within him. Garvey was a humanist. Garvey saw the world in global realities because he was race conscious, but he was humanistic. Garvey was so humanistic that when he was studying the oppression of people in Britain, he studied the Irish. Why did he study the Irish? Because this is where the British perfected assimilation, by wiping out the Irish language. But he became supportive of the Irish. So when Garvey had his first major rally in 1920 in Madison Square Garden, 25,000 Africans assembled. Garvey called for the freedom of Ireland. Is that racist? I don't think so. Garvey had a slogan: Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asians, Europe for the Europeans. Garvey was holding a rally in New York in the 1920s, and a little yellow man attended this rally. His name was Ho Chi Minh. You hear me? He would become the leader of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front, and he would be president of Vietnam. And he said, I sat in this rally, and I heard Garvey say, Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asians, and Europe for the Europeans. And he said, I concluded that I had no business working for the French. I should go back to Vietnam and kill me a whole bunch of French and free my people from French colonialism. You hear me? Garvey's humanism raised up yellow nationalism in the case of Vietnam. When Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, went to Vietnam in 1968, he met Uncle Ho Chi Minh. And Ho Chi Minh told him the same story I'm telling you. And then Ho Chi Minh said this. He said, Stokely, because his name then was Stokely, he said, Garvey told me to go back to Vietnam to free the Vietnamese. He said, what are you, Stokely, doing here in Vietnam? You should get your black behind to Africa to help free Africans. You hear me? So Garvey was so humanistic that he was encouraging people of color to free themselves. So much for Garvey being a racist. According to Cronin, Garvey was a fascist. He said he may not have understood it. Again, you know, we're dumb. You know what I mean? Now, this was a well-read man. This man read in his father's library. This man petitioned to study in the British Museum so that he could study Edward Wilmot Blyden, the foremost thinker among blacks in the 19th century. This man apprenticed under a man named Deuce Muhammad Ali, a Sudanese Egyptian. This man did some serious study on his own. And this is the key thing I want to say about Garvey's development. He did it through self-study. And guess what? Whether you're university educated or not, the most important education you get is self-education. Many of my students take black studies classes, and I tell them, if you think that everything you learn in this class is it, you're missing the point. Study is lifelong. And if you're going to undergo mental reconstruction, that's lifelong, because you can slip back into whiteness if you don't. You know what I'm telling you? Huh? So that Garvey is accused of being a fascist. Now check this one out. Now this is a key thing to understand about our history. I have a book called The Integration Trap. It's here. And what I do is look at the origin of democracy. Guess what? They tell you democracy began in Greece. Well, first of all, the Greeks aren't the first people. In fact, the Greeks inherited a good deal of their ideas from the Kemites. But guess what? Before the Greeks and the Kemites, there are little-known people called the Twa. Europeans call them pygmies. They came into being 144,000 years ago. And guess what? These were people where there were no rich, no poor, no people who were oppressed. Women weren't oppressed. Children weren't oppressed. The elders were not oppressed. And guess what? Their decisions were based not on majority vote, but on consensus. African decision-making around democracy is consensus decision-making. Do you know what, if Jamaicans, because this is a small island, just over 2-point-some-odd million people, you should have a say-so in everything that really affects your country. And if you had a consensus decision, I bet you'd have some good decisions. Am I telling you right? Oh, I don't know if you're getting this. Because you have to see beyond this system to really believe that you can do this. Because you see, one of the things about mental reconstruction is when you undergo mental reconstruction, you not only love yourself, but you're able to see beyond your enemy. You're able to see to a new day, which Garvey was able to. That's why he was prophetic. And guess what else happens? When you undergo mental reconstruction, you end up loving your people more than you love yourself. And when you love your people more than you love yourself, the only thing you will do is what is in your people's interest. Am I telling the truth? So the thing is, the Garvey movement inherited African people, the Caribbean. You know, we don't like people telling us what to do. We got to have a say-so in everything. The groups that are biggest are the ones that get a say-so. If Garvey had been a dictator, he would not have been able to organize no million black people. He might have been able to organize 100. Now, he was authoritative in private. That's a fact. But in fact, in his national conventions, he had to run for office. And there were Africans who stood up and said, I'm from Africa. I'm better qualified to be the provisional president of Africa. You know how we are. Everybody thinks he should be the big chief. And Garvey had to fight for his office. And when Garvey ran people for office, sometimes the people who ran for lost. Because, you know, we're going to look at them just because the leader says so. That don't mean we're going for it. You hear me? So the thing is, far from being a dictatorship, the Garvey movement was democratic. And chauvinism also means that males are preferred over females. And this is a big charge made against many of our movement. It's true. At the national level, there was only one national female leader. It's also true that Garvey's wife, Amy Jock Garvey, was a close collaborator with him. They had many arguments. And she helped organize his office. And I don't just mean as an office secretary. This was a well-thought-out woman. This was a brilliant woman. She wrote the book Garvey and Garveyism. So Garvey picked women who were his equals who should challenge him. And that's what black men should do today. You know what I mean? Get you some strong women that will challenge you. I sure can tell you I've got one. Got that Barbadian mouth. You know what I mean? Like you got the Jamaican mouth. There ain't no African woman who's lost their mouth. You understand? And you need one because they'll keep you straight. And you, by the way, sisters, they can keep you straight too. This is a two-way thing. But we understand that you all are the mothers, so you all end up with the edge. We understand it. Y'all is wiser in a whole lot of stuff. You hear me? So they charge him with chauvinism. But guess what? At the local level, Garvey, I don't think he knew this, he used an Asante system of organization. Every office at the local level had a male and female officer. President, male and female. Vice president, male and female. Secretary, male, female. Treasurer, male, female. Where'd that come from? The Asante. It comes from their dual stool. Asante Hina, king. Asante Wa, queen. King can't sit lest the queen sits. You understand? So women were empowered at the local level, and the base of the Garvey movement in the United States was in the South, where it was hardest to organize. He had 75 chapters in Louisiana alone. Now, if you could organize in a place where they'd lynch you for just being black, you had to be a hell of an organizer. You hear me? Two other features of the Garvey movement that are important, that come from the popular culture. One is spirit. You know, of all the things in the popular culture, before race consciousness, before communalism, before democracy, before family, is the spirit. Am I telling this right? The spirit that we call God, some of you call Jah, some call Ra, some call Jesus the Christ, some call Oludumare. You understand? We give them all different kinds of names. Africans have this concept of God, not as a physical being, but as spirit outside of space, outside of time. Vital force. That's God. God is in anything and everything, is nowhere and everywhere at the same time. Am I telling the truth? And the reason that our people have withstood enslavement, the reason why blacks in Jamaica have withstood separation, is we carry this spirit inside of us. We know we're divine, and sooner or later, we'll change our miseration to justice. You hear me? The Garvey movement was founded on that. What was the slogan? One God, one aim, one destiny. An IBI, Internal Bureau of Investigation. By the way, FBI and CIA have tried to kill me 3 times. I'm a warrior. I'm a martial artist. I'm good at shooting. I'm a strategist. By the way, I should say this. I've never lost a battle I've led. I don't believe in losing. I believe in tap dancing on the heads of my enemy, not them tap dancing on mine. You hear me? And I don't believe in martyrdom. If you end up being a martyr, great. But if you can avoid it, make your enemy a martyr. And if since he's doing wrong, ain't nobody going to worship him. King's a martyr to the movement because he stood for justice. You hear me? So the thing is, the Garvey movement was spiritual. This IBI, Internal Bureau of Investigation, before they became the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover's man, he made this observation. He said, among the Garveyites, Garveyism is like a religion. They regard Marcus Garvey as the Black Moses. Garvey never called himself that. In fact, when he was born, his mother felt it. You know, we're spirit-based. She wanted to call him Moses. The father said, he's born in August, the sign of Leo, he'll probably be a leader. So they compromised, and his middle name was Mosiah, which happened to be his father's middle name. So the parents had this sense that they had a special man-child there. Now, the thing about Garvey is this. He drew on a tradition, because Africans who came here from Africa, we had an African view of spirit. We saw God everywhere. Since God is outside of space, outside of time, God is vital force. God is everywhere. It's in a tree, it's in a rock, it's in the water, it's in every human being, it's in every creeping and crawling creature. Everything that God created is sacred. My neighbor and I, we had to trim some trees. And my neighbor Joe, he's looking after my house while I'm gone. Make sure nobody goes in there. Joe, look out for me. You know what I mean? And so when he was trimming this tree, his wife said, honey, those trees are spirits. You should be careful trimming those trees. They might not like being cut. And sure enough, he had a climber on a tree and he fell off. Fortunately, he didn't get hurt. And his wife said, see? You understand? So we're people that don't separate the spirit from the physical. And I want to say this. I'm a spirit person. My best ideas have come from the spirit realm. Most of my best books, the ancestors have spoken to me. Then I go and do the homework. I've never lost a battle because the spirit usually tells me where my enemy's weaknesses are. We all have that gift. If you follow your spirit, you'll never go wrong. Garvey had this saying. He said, man, woman, listen to your soul. And it is from your soul that your thoughts come. And if you operate on the spirit of the soul through your thoughts, you will be able to conquer anything in this world. Garvey didn't know that in Kemetic thought, that's called Sia, Hu, and Heka. Sia, exceptional intellectual clarity. That's the Ka that resides in your heart. And Hu means that when you draw from your soul, as Garvey said, your Ka, then you have authoritative utterance. Hu, speech is authoritative. And then Heka means magic, but it means powerful action. That's what Garvey was saying. I had a Jamaican who was moving some furniture for me a couple of weeks ago, and I said, what did Garvey mean to you? He said, he told me I could go anywhere in the world and do anything I want to do. But he said, more important, he told me I could believe in myself and accomplish anything I wanted to. You understand? Because he was drawn from the spirit thing. Garvey had a mystical, political thing going on, and he didn't do it deliberately. Garvey never claimed to be a black Moses. Garvey was about freedom. But the fact is, because the popular culture is spirit-based, that's how we interpret it. Now think about this. Why would black people give millions of dollars to the UNIA? You know how hard it is to get just a few pieces of money from black people. And you know the only group that it gets money from us is usually the church. Am I telling the truth? Usually the church. So how did a movement for liberation get black people to separate with millions and millions and millions of dollars? Guess what? And he didn't do this intentionally. See, this is the thing about liberation being an active culture. Most liberation movements and leaders aren't even conscious of the culture that are moving them. The Garvey movement wasn't conscious of the culture that moved them. The Garvey was conscious of the land, not of the rest of it. Civil rights movement was, black power movement wasn't, Nation of Islam wasn't. You understand? African liberation movements weren't. We need to be conscious of them now because we're losing it. We're becoming more like white people every day. And so if we don't become conscious of this, we can find ourselves in a dead end. So Garvey was able to get this money. Why? Check this one out. Now this is real African. He spiritualized business. Y'all hear this? Listen to this. He made giving up money a spiritual thing. Investing in business a spiritual, material thing. Because black people saw this as their salvation. They saw him as the black Moses, but they saw what they were putting in to business ventures as something higher than just something political or economic. And this is the mindset that comes out of our popular culture. We don't separate the spiritual from the physical. In my culture, the U.S., New African culture, it's a poor frog that don't praise its own pond too. You know what I mean? I don't care how muddy it is. In the spirituals, we don't see the spirituals as separate from the blues. In fact, the spirituals are the blues. Meaning, the spirituals are political at the same time. And in fact, it's white people that called them spirituals. Just like it's white people that called them blues. What does a blue-black person look like having the blues? That's a white person. You understand? And the blues are the spirituals. And so for us, the political and the spiritual go together. So here's the key to Garvey. No movement has succeeded among black people unless it's had a spiritual and political component tied together. It's got to have both. You hear me? It's got to have both. Garvey drew from Ethiopianism. The passage in the Bible, 68th Psalm, that says, God has scattered those who practice war. Princes shall come out of Egypt. Ethiopia shall stretch forth its hand unto God, and then our people added soon. Soon. Garvey never used the word Pan-Africanism. He was an Ethiopianist, but he was the best Pan-Africanist you could lay your eyes on. And he saw Ethiopia as representing the whole African continent. Garveyism is the inspiration for Rastafarianism, a big part of the inspiration for Rastafarianism. I got to quote my wife on this, because Bob Marley is one of the people that woke her up. See, I met her in the UK. In fact, it's interesting. This is the reward you get for serving black people. I was in the UK to speak at the 60th anniversary of the 5th Pan-African Congress, which I'm going to mention, and it'll be the final thing I go through this afternoon. I chaired the political committee for North America to the 6th Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So the last house I stayed in was my wife's house. So you see, what happens when you do the business of your people, God rewards you. You all hear me? And the best reward a black man can have is a good black woman. Isn't that right? Black woman is a black man's best friend. And vice versa, in case you don't know it. So Ethiopianism was like at the base of Rastafarianism. And my wife makes this observation. She said that the Rastafarians changed the intellectual trajectory of the African world. Because with your dreadlocks, you showed pride in your naturalness, in your natural beauty, and in your Ethiopian orientation, because Garvey had prophesied that an emperor would be crowned in Ethiopia in 1930. And Garvey's prophecies pretty much came true. And Haile Selassie was. So the thing is, Garveyism drew on Ethiopianism. It had a spirit base. And Ethiopianism was the basis for Pan-Africanism. Final point I want to make is on Pan-Africanism. Because you can't talk about Garvey unless you talk about Pan-Africanism. Am I telling the truth? Pan-Africanism is the gift of this new African culture. We should be proud of this. If you get nothing else out of what I said today, you ought to get this. We need to lift up what we built here, just as we lift up Kemet. Just as valuable as Kemet is valuable as this creative culture we have created right here. Because this is what has given us beauty in this part of the world. And so, there was no concept of Pan-African in Africa. It came from the United States and the Caribbean. We came up with that. And so what happened in enslavement, we concluded that many of us forgot what part of Africa we came from. But we also identified with the whole continent. So we embraced the whole of it. And so that is Pan-African. One Africa and one African people. Because it's not just the unification of the African continent, it's the unification of Africans wherever they are in the world. Pan-Africanism has an economic philosophy that I've mentioned, communalism, which means the land, the air, and the water should be shared. Many African independence leaders got this part wrong. Nyerere, I met Nyerere in the 70s, a great leader. And he took Ujamaa, which was familyhood, sharing at the village level, to revisit African communalism. But the one thing that Africans got wrong when they applied communalism that we need to get right now is to understand this. At the local level, the people should make the decisions on their own economy, not the national government. And the people should be allowed to make a profit. Hear this. Communalism does not rule out a profit, and profit doesn't make you a capitalist. Profit is what you need to survive, to put a roof over your head. If you're going to work, you need to get something from your work. Look at all these booths around here. They want to make a profit. That don't make them a capitalist. You hear me? So the thing is, this is the base of Pan-Africanism. Garvey was shipped out of the United States. He got a full pardon. That meant he should have been able to stay in the United States. But they shipped him out. And when they shipped him out, he said on board ship, and I know you've heard this, he said, "You will see me in the whirlwind. I'll come back in the thunder and lightning." And then he also said this in the 20s. He said, "A second world war will occur in 20 years. Now, this is prophecy. I'm no prophet. I can't prophesize what's going to happen tomorrow, you know. And he said the Japanese will line up against many of the Western powers. And then he said this. He said, "Out of the ashes of World War II, Africa will strike its blow for freedom, and Asia will strike its blow for freedom." And sure enough, in 1945, Africans from South Africa, East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, from the Caribbean, your first Prime Minister, Norman Manley, came to, and Africans from the Caribbean and the U.S. assembled in Manchester, England, for the most important meeting Africans have held in the 20th century, the 5th Pan-African Congress. Most of our people in the United States know about the Continental Congress. Most people know all about the British Parliament. But how many of our people know about the 5th Pan-African Congress? I know the conscious Africans do, but the rest of us need to. Why was it the most important meeting of Africans in the 20th century? Because Africans decided to free Africa, and when they left that Congress, they proceeded to do it. You hear me? Jomo Kenyatta was there. Kwame Nkrumah was there. George Padmore, who Nkrumah was studying under, whose real name was Malcolm Nurse, from Trinidad, was there. You understand? Ezekwe, who would become president of Nigeria, was there. And so the first leader of an independent African state was Kwame Nkrumah after the Sudan in the 20th century. And what did Kwame Nkrumah say, who was one of the great visionaries of Africa? He said, of all the writings I've read, the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey has been most inspirational. When he built his steamship line, what did he call it? The Black Star Line. Garvey's ghost was at the 5th Pan-African Congress because assembled with over 200 delegates were everyday grassroots Africans who came from trade union movements combined with intellectuals. And serving as chair was W.E.B. Du Bois. And so Pan-Africanism has proven to be the hope for Africans in the 20th and 21st century. I want to say this. It's the most advanced idea that we have put forward politically. It's more advanced than Pan-Europeanism because the European Union was not brought about because Europeans love Europeans. Pan-Africanism came about because Africans love Africans, even some who claim they aren't African. Because when you see South Africa getting hit up, those same Africans will march and demand freedom for South Africa. Am I telling the truth? The Europeans have a European Union because the Germans caused 2 world wars, and they want to box them in. And so this is a box-in operation. This ain't no love operation. And so with African people, Pan-Africanism, one Africa, comes about as a result of love. I want to also make this observation. Garveyism has proven to be a stronger force than Zionism. Zionism had the backing of the Western powers. The only way they could take Palestine from the Palestinians was with Western support, with nearly $3 billion of free aid coming from the United States. But Garveyism and Pan-Africanism has been functioning on its own steam. African people funded the Garvey movement because they believed in the ideals of the movement because it came from our culture. Imagine this. We went up against the whole world and built the movement without the support of anything but black people. I want to say this as a final point. What's the value of Garvey today? If Garveyism could be unleashed through the popular culture and through the talents of good leadership, then what can our culture do with good leadership today for our people? And I would suggest to you that just as many of your leaders called for a Caribbean federation, Africans in the Caribbean need an economic federation so that you deal with Europe and the United States as an economic bloc. Am I telling the truth? We as Africans need to come together and have Pan-African unity in the Western Hemisphere. That is, Africans in the U.S., Africans in the Caribbean, Africans in South America. And here I'm talking about stateless Africans. We as people in our own organization need to come together and bond together and come up with our own agenda. There is a 7th region in the Organization of African Unity, and people's organizations should represent those, that represent the interests of the poor people who are undergoing sufferation. So if we draw from the best of our cultural traditions, we can take something in the United States as crooked as a pretzel and straighten it out. We can take something in Jamaica that may be oppressive, but you Jamaicans don't take a lot of mess. You know, Jamaicans are known to rise up. In Britain, you all are the radicals. Every other Caribbean group is called Jamaican. And when there's time to cause trouble, you all usually causing it. So it seems like in the Western Hemisphere, we're the two biggest trouble causers, United States and Jamaica. And I should point this out. You may not be aware of this, but you should be. There's only two real groups of Africans outside of Africa that when they start a movement, it becomes a global movement. That's in the U.S. and Jamaica. Every now and then Haiti, because of what they did to free themselves. Those are the strongest people in the Western Hemisphere, the Haitians. Only people to destroy slavery. Only people in the history of the world. And they deserve our support. That occupation that the UN has needs to be removed. Bill Clinton and the rest of them need to be pulled out. Those sweatshops that are there need to pull them out. The best thing the United States can do is leave the world alone. So I want to say to you, it's been an honor to share some thoughts with you on the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. He represented the best of our people. He gives us the inspiration to keep on keeping on. Hotep. Thank you.
Knowing how much Professor Oba T'Shaka loved Jamaican grown provisions, the best thing we could do to say thank you is to give him a basket of yam and dasheen and cocoa to carry back with him. But for now, firstly, we want to give him a tremendous round of applause.
Yeah, man, this is Clive, a.k.a. Chris Zogo, you know. One, you can give me a minute to make a talk to your listeners, them. Yeah, man, this, I talk to Muta listeners from Jamaica, US, Britain, and the world, you know. Especially the one them with on YouTube and BS and Roman channel. You know, for over 20 years, Muta, I highlight problem them and I get solution. But, you know, I feel black people, but Muta alone can't do it alone, you know. But all we do, as them listeners, we do, we talk and we complain amongst ourselves. And pass blame and away the government, white man, rich man, and Jah and Jesus to solve them. Black people, if you know, say, and a responsibility to other people solve them problem, you know. If you know, say, the man we have been put by his neck, now take it off and let you lick it off and pump him in the face and stick in a fin short. Government is doing good, you know. Because you see them a drive Pajero and the regular artists, them alright, because them don't make it. And I see them a pop champagne, flat BMW, and I be a big mansion, but, you know, them not be no factory for employee. You know, the problem that I face working and poor class don't affect them. I can't believe how fool on be, you know, they're wait for same people who cause the problem to fix it. We complain about foreigner, buy up Jamaica, but instead, we buy up Jamaica, we buy up foreign goods. You don't know where nothing said and get the money from. I see your money when you buy them goods and use back and come buy up Jamaica to use against you. They complain about Monsanto, but we shop at the supermarket all the time. And we don't even try to create our own supermarket that we sell our own organic food. So we leave it up to them to solve our problem with them create. Marcus Garvey said, if we can't do what other races do, you know, we don't deserve to die. And that is exactly what happened to me right now. If you can't own the wholesale like the Chinaman, you don't deserve to stay poor and jobless. If you can't own the multinational like the white man, you will stay at the bottom of the political and economic system and big IMF. If you can't own the big farm like Monsanto, you deserve to die from cancer and death of famine. Muta give you no solution to your problem. But Muta, you alone don't have the money to solve a big problem, yeah. So if we put the money together, we can create the big man, big corporation, or big business that will represent our interests and agenda to work to solve our problem. I say, we don't say already, you know, if 1,000 Muta listener put $1,000 US, that's $1 million US, 100 million Jamaica can set a foundation, start a business. We are going to invest in building and expanding black business like farm, supermarket, car creator, transportation, etc., etc. Which will provide wealth and jobs amongst our own by ourselves. Talking and complaining is good, you know, because they highlight the problem. But it's time to build business and structure to solve the problem that we complain about so much. Every race have them structure set up. That is why you can see Chinese come from China, set up shop, and stock it out with all Chinese need. All of that man know to do is just be a buyer. You can't even blame the Chinese, you know, because they're not doing it for yourself anyways. My solution, another be all and all, but it's one thing that is in your power to do and can create a system that will outlast us all alive now, you know. Muta is the only man in Jamaica I feel that is trustworthy. That is why I'm willing to invest $1,000 US in him to set up a business to build our system. There must be at least, 1,000 of him listeners who believe in real self-reliance. If not, I guess that Jamaican is doomed to want to be beggars. $1,000, I don't know, why? Because, Jamaicans spend more than that on ganja, liquor, bleaching cream, clothes and car and big house, etc. In overconsumption. If you don't have 1,000, then you know what? Can't get 10 people to join you as one then. So I want all the serious Muta listeners them to email muta@irfm.net. Call up and tell them say, you're ready to invest in him to build a phone system. So that me want to the people in Muta.
Blessed man, give thanks. That sounds serious. That sounds very, very serious. Very serious. I could have never